Okay, then we can get started. Today there's a double and sort of even a triple feature in a way, which of course when we're talking about theatricals is a natural thing to do. There are far too many lectures and other events at this university that are a one-person show. So today is a two-person show. Apart from myself, whom you know already, Damaris Stein, who wrote her bachelor thesis on melodrama and is currently finishing her Master of Education thesis on theater pedagogy and theater didactics. So I'll start, then she takes over, then we'll have a special guest for a short text excerpt from Maggie, and then I'll finish up again.
Stage is all yours.
For the moment. Talking about the theater of Stephen Crane's times, what we're talking about is a variety of theatrical performances, of course. The most played, most performed theater author of the 19th century is, drum roll, William Shakespeare. So there's that. And then there are a variety of other authors from around the world. But those features that are special for the late 19th century, the period that we're talking about, and the early 20th century, are on the one hand the theater of realism, as exemplified by people like Ibsen, Shaw, and Strindberg, and others, and the vast field of popular drama entertainment, the melodrama, and specifically the sensation melodrama. And if you now wonder whether you've ever heard of theatrical successes, stage successes by Stephen Crane, and or you may have missed out on them, no you didn't, Stephen Crane's theater was mostly a theater of war. And I like this photograph in particular. If you get a chance to look at it in more detail, you'll notice that this was taken by a company name of Boehringer, very Greek name, insofar as this photograph was taken in a photo studio in Athens, Greece, in May 1897. More about that next time when we're talking about Stephen Crane's Europe and Stephen Crane's Orient. So the theater of Stephen Crane's times. Melodrama. Yep. A lot of hand-wringing and a lot of rejection, abjection, grand gestures for an audience that, notably in the United States, was of questionable capacity when it came to understanding English. And if you don't understand English, you still understood the grand gesture, which you still see in the silent movies, so this was not necessarily something that the silent movies introduced because of their silence. It was something they inherited from the melodrama. Already something I would guess you've never heard before. It's kind of strange because in many ways the melodrama anticipates the silent movie, and also, I'll say this already now and I'll probably repeat it at the end, the melodrama, and specifically the sensation melodrama, is one of the media in media history that changes media, switches media at some point, lock, stock, and barrel, and moves on to another genre, one of the genres that switches media. So melodrama moves on and becomes silent movies, movie theater. And of course, sensation movies we've had since then, usually with a lot of extravaganza, a lot of money spending and all that. The playbill for today. First, I'll talk a bit about melodrama and realism. Then, as we said, Damaris takes over for the sensation stage, and specifically for fire plays exemplified using Edmund Price's One of the Bravest, and then I'll come back with Crane and the theater. And there's no intermission here. So, melodrama. Where does the melodrama originally come from? It's a late 18th century phenomenon originally, and it has a decidedly revolutionary aspect. So this is really theater for the masses, in which there is, from the beginning, the typical trias of hero, heroine, and villain. The villain very often is an aristocrat. There's the revolutionary part already. In the later 19th century in England and in the US, the aristocracy aspect isn't that important any longer, but the villain is usually somebody with a French name. So apparently they'd forgotten why this was a Frenchman to begin with. Then there are specific sidekick figures. Often it's a father who's under the thumb of the villain, or it's a brother who's either under the thumb of the villain or tries to save his sister from the villain and gets himself killed. Or it's a comical sidekick who originally sides with the villain and then at some point comes over to the light side. There is nobody going over to the dark side. That's a 20th century phenomenon, late 20th century phenomenon. The plots are absolutely loaded with coincidences, logical or not, usually not, but that in a way absolves the author from having to think too much about anything like logical coherence. You can always have coincidence instead. And there is fragmenting the plot even further. Usually song, there's music. That's why it's called melodrama, from Greek melos, song. This predominance of spectacle elements tends to overtake the logic of the plot, even in plays that originally are grounded in logic, like, for instance, Uncle Tom's Cabin. You can see here an 1870s, 1880s version of it, and by the sort of dance and sing patterns, you can guess that at this point the original logic of the play has given way to this becoming more and more spectacular, more and more a fun and frolic type of show. You know, the show aspect becomes more important than the plot itself. Given the importance of song and music, it might come as a surprise that we have hardly any evidence of the music itself. There's very little to tell us what was being played. In many cases, we have songs in the plays, but we have no idea what the music to that song was like. Unless it's a phenomenon that we'll meet again at the very end when I talk about Stephen Crane. That is, there's a popular tune, and now we get a text made for this particular play here. Diane Lardner-Boucicault's The Colleen One is one of the very few plays for which we have the complete musical score. And until a few years ago, that was the only one, at least that I'd ever heard of. And there's a man by the name of Michael Pisani who's devoted 20 years of his life to that research. And then, lo and behold, my student Hannah Essig comes along and finds the total score for one of those firefighter plays, The Still Alarm. Can't go into too much detail about that, but this was a major find in melodrama history. Another feature that is important to understand melodrama of the period is its sometimes rabid anti-intellectualism. John Frick says in his study of it, Americans have staunchly maintained that the life of the mind is suspect and have correspondingly constructed their cultural heroes as men of action rather than men of speculative thought. And if you look at the disaster that we had with the last, not the present one, the last president of the United States, you get an idea that this feature of American mind work, of American intellectualism and anti-intellectualism is still rampant. And in fact, it's a phenomenon that you can trace all the way back through the 20th century. So this action orientation again influences and inspires plays and the action of plays. Plus one more feature, and that's technology. So in a way, anti-intellectualism and technology, or praise of technology, do not really go that well together, one should think. That is, if you're stupid, you can't operate more intricate technical features. But that is not true yet for the 19th century. Most of this is very mechanical. What it overlooks, however, is, Frick, for instance, overlooks the fact that there are a lot of very plucky heroines, too. So heroism is not limited to the male figure. Action, they're more like the action types, yes, and often the woman provides the brains. Intellectualism in the United States should maybe be left to the women. And definitely in those melodramas, that's what we see. And here we have the first instance of a victim being tied to the rails and then saved at the last minute. Being tied to the rails in order to be run over by a train must be the single most ineffective way of disposing of your enemies, insofar as it never works. Now, not here, and not in the later 19th century, and not all the way to James Bond in the 1960s. I forget which one of the James Bond movies that was, but there it's also being used. So helpful advice: if you want to dispose of an enemy, don't tie them to the rails. Use a baseball bat or something like that. The inventor of this spectacle scene was a man by the name of Augustin Daly, who wrote and co-wrote more than 100 plays in this period, ran theaters both in New York and in London, and here we have another feature of the melodrama, that is, it's a transnational genre, which made it hugely unpopular with the nationalist historiographers, literary historiographers of the 20th century, because you couldn't claim certain plays and certain authors for your nation, the US or Britain or Ireland. These people switched places, went from one to the other. Boucicault, for instance, is originally Irish, works in England, works in the US, works in Australia, and all of them in this nationalist period claimed him as theirs, and if they didn't want to have nothing to do with him, which was also a possibility. So transnational genre, a trans-genre format with its affinities to the operetta and the musical, which develops out of a mixture of opera and melodrama. Then it is the dramatic version of the usually prose adventure story. And other than most of the highbrow literature from Romanticism through Realism and into Modernism, it absolutely loves modern technology. You know? In Modernism, ever since the Futurists, Modernists have been rather wary and critical of modern technology, not so the sensation melodrama. This all now sounds as if it would be difficult to argue that this kind of theater has anything to do with realism. Yes and no. There is, as I said, a theatrical realism at the time anyway, and the melodrama partakes in it to a greater extent than what I've said so far might have made you assume. For one, there is, and that's almost already everything, there is this insistence on the objectifiable, that is, on observable facts. They may happen coincidentally, so the fact that the steamboat explodes once the hero has conveniently left it, preferably together with the heroine, that's the coincidence, but steamboats did explode. And with astonishing frequency even, because boiler systems were not that safe at the time. The same with railroads, which is what I'm going to focus on briefly in the following. There were a lot of railroad accidents. Charles Dickens lived through one and wrote about it if you're interested in a story of a railroad accident. Other than that, it was, of course, more convenient for the railroad companies also if accidents with trains could be attributed to the evil machinations of some melodrama villain, rather than to their reluctance, because it's expensive, to build in, for instance, air brakes, which would have been available already at the time. So if a train couldn't brake in time, it was the machinations of the villain, or else you get hero stories like the Casey Jones song you may have heard at some point. Casey Jones? Anybody familiar with Casey Jones? Casey Jones kept his jumper running. Casey Jones, the devil said a fine. Casey Jones, start and shovel and sulfur. That's what you get for scabbing on the SP line. Now that was actually a trade union parody of the original Casey Jones song. But Casey, John Luther Jones from Casey, Kentucky, which is why it was called Casey Jones, hung on to the brake on his train rather than jump off, which would have saved his life, when his passenger train was approaching a freight that was the end of which was still standing in the main track rather than have gotten onto the sideline. Something being sidelined usually meant that there were sort of passing moments on train tracks where you could put one train into the sideline and the other one would go through the main. So he hit that end of the freight train at still considerable speed, but he was the only person killed in that accident, which made him a hero, but as I said, the whole thing might have been avoided otherwise. I'm detracting from theatrical realism, but these effects, how do you stage a train wreck on a stage? That's something for theater architecture, and that's something for what I talk about here when I say realism. In the original, let's just go back briefly, in the original Augustin Daly production of this play called Under the Gaslight, there were some people who carried across the stage a contraption made out of canvas and wood, and they made puffing noises, and the thing fell apart halfway across stage, resulting in some unscripted mirth and laughter by the audience. In later plays, they did considerably better. We'll get to that in a minute. What we shouldn't look for in these plays is anything like linguistic realism. So there is a continuation of the old romantic stereotypes. The hero speaks manly. The heroine, in a way also, Yeah, well, they're often not very girlish or anything. But what we definitely still have is on the sidekick level and on the antagonist level, stage Irish, stage German, stage African-Americans with all the trimmings. And what we should also not look for is anything like psychological realism. That's the realm of Ibsen, of Strindberg, of George Bernard Shaw, and of course there are the compulsory happy endings with these melodramas. From the looks of it, however, you wouldn't believe that there is that much of a difference between them. Here is a scene from Augustin Daly's The Railroad of Love, which, however, doesn't really have a lot to do with railroads. I just picked that one up. But it has the typical realist stage effects here with the Victorian parlor in the background, fourth wall theater perfectly, everything in its place as it would have been in a typical upper middle class household of the period. That's not as difficult to reproduce as a railroad is, obviously. The railway mania of the period integrated trains into romantic concepts. So having a train in a theater was a technological feat, yes, but the train was not an evil machine. No, it's a positive thing. As I said before, they're absolutely in love with technology, despite the fact that locomotive engine and railway terror, as Nicholas Daly, no relation to Augustine, calls it, was also the order of the day. And putting something like this on stage was, as I said, a challenge. I said before that this is a transnational genre and a transgenre phenomenon. What you also get is that that there is a lot of trans-author motif trade. And after the first victim being tied to the rails, you get scores of others. Here's Diane Boucicault, whom I mentioned before, who picked up immediately from Augustin Daly and had here a victim tied to the rails and saved on the last minute, of course, also. Elmer Elsworth Vance's The Limited Male has the plucky heroine save not just one victim tied to the rails, but a whole train and all the passengers on it by running along the tracks, waving a light so that she can be seen in time. Don't try this at home. Trains today tend to run faster, even though you wouldn't believe it sometimes with the delays that the German railway system manages to produce on a daily basis. Yeah, this is downright dangerous, so avoid, at least don't stand on the tracks. And here we have, we get an idea of what this train on stage thing actually looked like. This is a photograph from a production of Ramsay Morris's The 90 and 9. Again, the title rather inconspicuous, but referring to a train number in a story that's based on a historical event even. And the historical event being the Hinckley, Minnesota fire of 1894, when two wildfires, this is not a very new phenomenon in American history, two wildfires coincided and joined and enclosed the town of Hinckley in Minnesota on 1st September of that year, killed a total of more than 400 people. The exact number has never been determined, but one of the feats of valor that prevented another 300 people from getting killed was an engineer by the name of Root, James Root, running his train backwards into the town of Hinckley, loading it with people, and then running out again to a shallow lake, which you see here in this picture at the bottom left, where everybody could then run from the already burning train and douse themselves with this swampy, muddy water there, and most of those people survived. About 30 died anyway, even in this feat. But so these kind of things were regularly turned into drama stories. And in this case, it wasn't the train that failed, it was a combination of events. One second. The train here looks like it's actually made for the occasion. There were, however, scenarios in which a pop-up theater was constructed next to the roundhouse in a city, and then in the respective sensational scene, you would have the wings fold back and the whole train run through the theater. Now, the most spectacular one was probably Lincoln Carter's The Fast Mail, where you have a scene in which it's absolutely essential that the mail bag is handed from one train to the next. Yes, 2 trains through the theater, one going this way, one going the other way. Yeah, it doesn't get any more spectacular than that. And of course, if a play like this, which demanded hell of a lot of money to build these theaters and hire these trains, and maybe they were even your own trains, that you transported your whole stuff on for a transnational tour of this play, if that failed, you were broke. And here's another reason why this then is taken, this whole genre is swallowed by the movie industry. It was simply cheaper. Well, it was quite simply cheaper. If you have ever seen The Great Train Robbery, one of the first feature films that we still have, and for a while everybody talked just about that one as early feature films, that's 1.5 scenes from a play by one Scott Marble called also The Great Train Robbery. So transferring there meant you could make more copies of a film, and that way more profit, and the whole production in itself was cheaper. You could have other technologies. Here, for instance, it's a saw, a circular saw, that's threatening to cut the hero in half, and again we have the plucky heroine breaking through the door and saving the day at the last moment. The craziest I've come across in terms of technology so far is this one here. Again, completely inconspicuous title, A Nutmeg Match. I have no idea what that refers to, because the play, like so many others, is lost. We have only about 3,000 plays, the texts of about 3,000 plays out of the 15,000 that were registered by the Copyright Drama Collection in the Library of Congress between 1870 and 1915. Damaris is going to say a little bit more about how that happens and why these plays are not available. But the techno-sensationalism here is really a sort of all technologies welcome thing, insofar as perilous flight beneath the ponderous pile driver. Pile driver. That's the thing that rams stabilizing beams into the ground in order to build, for instance, a railroad dam or something like that. So, yeah, all technologies welcome. So, if its style and thought, this is the melodrama, were primitive, the special effects of melodrama were sophisticated products of the latest advances in applied sciences, as I said. And then, and this I mentioned already, the realistic staging were only surpassed by the advent of motion pictures. This is a Goodreads entry, and it's, as I said, a little bit besides the point insofar as it's not so much surpassed as taken over, swallowed whole as the complete industry. And with that, we move on into the formal features of one of those types of plays, that is the fire play.
Thank you. So fire plays are also among the classic melodramas in the 19th century, and so are their heroes. Although the most famous of the firefighter heroes is Moe's in A Glance at New York by Benjamin Baker, we will look today at another fire play, namely One of the Bravest by Edmund E. Price, written in 1883. The script of this play is from the Sherman Theater collection at the Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, where it and many other melodramas are sadly but literally simply rotting away or falling apart. So to prevent that from happening for One of the Bravest, we, and when I say we, I'm referring to Angelika Zehmann, who has worked with me on this together, we decided to edit one of these plays, One of the Bravest by Edmund E. Price. So first of all, who was Edmund E. Price? So Price was born in London in 1832 and then emigrated to the United States, where he first pursued a career as a boxer. He then settled in Boston in the 1850s, but after giving up his boxing career, he moved to New York to start as a lawyer, still not a playwright. But as a lawyer or a criminal attorney, he worked with the underworld clientele, such as Bowery saloon keepers, brothel madams, opium den proprietors, or concert hall owners. And his personal professions, first as a boxer, then as a lawyer, they contributed to his work as a playwright. We don't really know whether Crane knew Edmund E. Price, probably not, but Price's plays were performed when Crane was alive and before he left for Europe as well. Price had a long life, much longer than Crane. He died in 1907 at the age of 75. As Professor Hochbruck said earlier, due to the extremely expensive spectacle sensation scenes, there was not a lot of money left for the author himself. And also, a lot of plays fell victim to copyright piracy. I mean, copyright issues or copyright law was not really a thing in the 19th century, so all the authors tried to keep their plays for themselves and not get them printed, because if they were printed, they were simply stolen by another author, and then they would lose all the opportunity to make money with it. So back to fire plays. Fires were an everyday occurrences, and the firemen were easy identification material for urban boys and men who followed with great enthusiasm how the fire engines and their crews, in their originally leather-colored protective suits, fought against fires. So all of this has to do with the fact that the average American citizen had to live in constant anticipation of another fire breakout in your own neighborhood. Consequently, the safety of your life and your property relied heavily upon your local fire department, and that on a pretty regular basis. So fire often destroyed houses in major American cities, heightening the awareness of the danger of a fire breakout. But not only households fell victim to the flames, but theater houses were also as much at risk to burn down and I'm quoting Professor Hochbruck here, because fires were an everyday occurrence, notably in the 19th century cities, and a clear and ubiquitous danger, including in those places where melodramas and movies were screened and performed. Almost all American theaters seem to have burned down at least once. So to see fire on stage and on celluloid, and to see its danger subdued by good and reliable male heroes, fulfilled the entertainment dream. So living under these circumstances, a fire represented a real threat, which was reproduced on the melodramatic stage for an audience that remained in a seemingly safe distance. So firefighter plays could connect the excitement and fear of this well-known danger with the satisfaction of seeing it tamed by the only brave hero that is able to do so, the fireman. Furthermore, as Professor Hochbruck already said, when the fire is set as a villain, is set by a villain, and it's not an unlinked event, or it just happens by coincidence or a technical issue, the hero can fulfill his heroic potential by fighting against this fire. So apart from the firefighter hero image, the main attraction of a melodrama is the sensation scene. In One of the Bravest, we have two of them, and they are well incorporated in the plot of the play. So much like cliffhangers in modern day series, the sensation scenes are strategically placed at the end of Act 1 and Act 2. And as Owen Davis puts it, he was a famous melodramatic playwright, and he stated in an interview with the New York Herald in 1909, "You must create a situation at which the audience must shout and yell at the end of each act. Melodramatic audiences like to whoop and hooray, so you've got to give them an opportunity." The first minor sensation scene in One of the Bravest consists of a steamboat explosion. I will not go into detail here, but later on I will go into detail with the second sensation scene of One of the Bravest, and that is, of course, what else could it be? A massive fire scene. So sensation scenes are an integral part of the melodramatic action, and these scenes, such as the fire scenes, they could be included at any possible opportunity in a play as a sort of ready-made spectacle. As already briefly touched upon, the fireman is an iconic heroic figure in the US history. This poster, an advertising poster for One of the Bravest, illustrates that the advertising of this play was also aimed at exactly that iconic figure. We see two firemen. They fight the fire wearing the iconic helmet and the axe. I'm not an expert in firefighting, Hochbruck is, but I don't think an axe is going to do a lot against fire. So I think in this poster they tried to get at the pictorial aspect, and that was much more important. Yeah, all right. Pictorial aspect. And that was much more important than a realistic portrayal of a firefighter. This is too big for me. On the posters, it says in the inscription, "Fighting the foe." And this transforms the fire into the villain, and it's not an accident or, So we create a causal link between the hero and the fireman. This heroic narrative of the New York firemen has also been expanding to modern day media due to the portrayal in the melodramas, just like One of the Bravest or The Still Alarm by Joseph Arthur as well. The poster of One of the Bravest here displays fragments of Charles McCarthy's name on top. You can barely see it. Most likely because Charles McCarthy was the producer and also star actor of the play. By comparison, its author, Edmund E. Price, is not as often mentioned as McCarthy in the reviews, AdWords, posters of this melodrama. So much like Frank Janfro, who coined this famous image of the character Mose in this other firefighter play, Charles McCarthy seems to have generated a star phenomenon with One of the Bravest. So for example, in these two ads of One of the Bravest, Edmund E. Price is mentioned, but Charles McCarthy's name is also written much bigger, and I guess if the Rock Island Fire Department couldn't get Charles McCarthy, or if they could have gotten him, they probably would also put his name on it, on this ad. You can also see from these ads that the focus was on the spectacular fire scenes, as, for example, one says, "Greatest fire scene ever produced." And another one says, "Sensational comedy drama of the present day." And melodramas were pop culture, so dealing with everyday topics, closely linked to daily life, and these sensation scenes who were supposed to appeal to the masses. So in the following minutes, I would like to introduce you to One of the Bravest by Edmund E. Price. I'm using this character constellation chart so that you can follow and that you know who I'm talking about. So I will give you a quick overview. The play consists of 3 acts, and the plot, to be honest, is fairly complicated. I will leave out many details, but I hope you will get the gist of the main storyline. There are many small storylines aside, but that would take too long now. But if you're interested in reading the play, shoot me an email. I can send the transcript to you. Okay, so the first act of One of the Bravest is full of action, and the conflict is introduced right at the start. We have Rufus Ward, in red here, the villain, and he lost money he was entrusted with by his business partner, John Heath. Excuse me. And John Heath demands it back. Rufus then sees no other option than to get his evil sidekick, Tiger, to kill John Heath, and Tiger delightfully fulfills this task by blowing up the whole steamboat, which John Heath has just stepped upon. Larry Howard, our hero, does not manage to save Mr. Heath, but he shouts at the end of Act 1, "It is murder, and I swear to avenge his death." This is Act 1. In Act 2, the new conflict, which is basically the old conflict in a new dress, arises. So Mrs. Heath now receives the papers of her husband's business. Rufus tries to gain possession of these papers because he wants to cover up his crimes. So he first asks sort of politely, but then of course he uses force. Larry comes in to help, but fails to beat Rufus and Tiger. So Rufus and Tiger leave the house with Mrs. Heath's child, little Mary, as hostage because Mrs. Heath hid the papers. So they leave the house, they lock the door, and they set fire to the house. This means that the last scene of Act 2 is this massive fire scene, which I will tell you about more later. The third and last act is determined by the search for Mrs. Heath's daughter, and because she has been brought to Hopwash's opium den, which is disguised as a laundrette. So basically Larry dresses up as Hopwash to enter the laundrette, and Mrs. Grogan smuggles out Mary in a basket full of washing where Larry, disguised as this Chinaman, put her shortly before. So when Mrs. Heath then meets Rufus to hand over the box with the papers in exchange for her daughter, the play abruptly ends with Larry Howard throwing off his Chinaman's garb, and with the help of the police officer McGinty and another fireman, they arrest Rufus and Tiger. The child is reunited with her mother, and the curtain falls. That's the end of the play. Okay, so I tried to keep it short, but I've left out some of the plot, but we will get to that later. And I also left out some of the characters, which you can see on the character constellation, because the play has a lot of characters, but we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so we have we're dealing with low literature, if you can call it that, or simply bad literature in some of the cases. So when editing One of the Bravest, we decided to keep it that way. We did not want to improve any of the literary aspects, but we wanted to make the play again available, that you can read through it, and that to make it maybe possibly even performable again. So we had to look at pages full of spelling mistakes, typos, or just really bad and hard to understand typing. I brought you some examples of this process, and with regards to, first of all, legibility, then second, about plot and coherence. This is also where I'm going to talk a bit about the characters, and then performability. Let's start with legibility. So this is a good example of what we had to face when working through those transcripts. I'll just give you a minute to read through it. So this part is actually not from One of the Bravest, but from A Firemans Sweetheart, which is a melodrama by Nelson Compton. But I like the example because the text is still sort of comprehensible. The lady is making sense, but we have a multitude of typos, simple spelling mistakes. We have issues with overlapping letters, which is a typical typewriter phenomenon. And we also have problems with spacing. So if we look at this, the first typo is in the fourth word, but I can't help it. So can't is written with an M instead of an N. Then with help, there you see that two letters are printed on top of each other. And if you go through the third last line, and got them ready, we see that there was a problem with spacing. There is a space in the word ready, which should not be there. And then just two words on, we have ready for wearing and, so there is no space where there should be one. So it's the same mistake, but reversed in this transcript. Then we also have things, examples like this one. The red arrow points at one word, which is not clearly written. We have several letters overlapping here. They overlap in the beginning and they overlap in the end, so you don't really know how long the word is, or neither does us the context really tell what it's supposed to mean. And in our editing process, we decided that it would make the most sense, that it most likely means makes. So he hooks a rope to the ring hanging over the roof, makes a twist on the hook of his belt. So I mean, it's an educated guess. It could mean something else, technically. It is not very likely, but we can't prove it that it's definitely makes here. So this was just to give you a glimpse at how, in what condition these texts are. Now I would like to move on to plot and coherence. So let's take a look at this in one of the bravest. We ask ourselves, so who are the characters, who is on stage and when are they on stage, are there any plot holes, is it at all stageable, do the entrances and the exits work? So the issues with one of the bravest start already with the cast of characters page. You can see the original script and our transcript on this slide. So to be honest, when I first read the play, I was really confused about who's who. And the cast of characters page was not really helping. It contains names of characters who are called differently in the play. For instance, we have Buster Kelly on the list, and his name is never mentioned in the play at all. The cast of characters sheet gives us his alias, which is Tiger, and this is the name which is used throughout the whole play. But for example, that is not the case for the policeman Mandoon, which you can also see on the cast of characters sheet. Because in the play, he's called McGinty throughout, and Mandoon is a name that never appears at all. Then we have Zeke Chamberlain on the cast of characters list. He doesn't appear either. He appears as 41 on stage, but other characters call him Zeke in their direct speech, so you could, who they were referring to. Then, in addition, we have Hopwash, who actually appears, who does not appear as a real character on stage, but he's merely a disguise of Larry Howard's, and therefore should be played by the same actor. And then lastly, we have Little Mary. She gets kidnapped by Rufus and is saved, but she's throughout the play always referred to as the child. Another question we asked ourselves about Little Mary was, is she played by a child or an adult? Because throughout the play, she speaks like an adult, but in the last act, Larry puts her in a washing basket and she's carried out. So, yeah. So in general, there are lots of characters that are not needed for the main plot, which would simply need Larry the hero, Rosie as our heroine, Rufus Ward as the villain, and maybe Little Mary as the victim of the villain. But unfortunately, we are not done with characters yet. For example, in this scene, 41, alias Zeke Chamberlain, talks to Larry about his legacy as a firefighter. So 41 tells Larry, "Now Larry, I must be off, but before I go I want to tell you something. Your father used to run with the old 41 engine, and you bet your life he was a good one. So any day you have a day off, come down and see me. I'll show you how to couple and uncouple. I'll give you more pointers in a minute, then you can learn in the fire department in a lifetime." And then it says in the stage directions, walks Jakey to the first exit on the right, but there was no one on stage except for 41 and Larry, and Jakey is not a character in the play, he does not exist, so who the hell is Jakey and how did he get on stage? Things like that happen in these melodramas, and I just hope that if you were to perform a melodrama like this, well, I hope that you don't contract the people according to the cast of characters list, because that might cause some problems. But one of the bravest does not only have problems with the cast of characters, but also with storylines. For example, moving on to another interesting plot choice. In the first act, we have a bit more than 3 pages of Larry, our great hero, trying to convince Rosie, our heroine, to marry him by promising her an apartment together, pointing out that he's a good match, being an honorable firefighter, and so on and so forth. So Larry proposes to Rosie in the following way.
Who, me? Why, Rosie, not another word, but answer this question. Will you have me?
Of course, I will. So, thank you for this help. So, very romantic. So you could think that this romantic love story will lead to a happy ending, maybe a marriage at the end in Act 3, who knows, but it's never mentioned again. Rosie doesn't even appear in the third act at all. So we have no idea where Rosie went off to. Maybe she found another cute, brave firefighter to get married with, or, I don't know, Larry was too busy playing the hero. It's definitely a storyline that simply gets lost along the way. Okay. First of all, when it comes to performability, so when you actually want to stage a melodrama like this, stage directions are important. We've already seen that the stage directions of One of the Bravest are not brilliantly thought through, but we also have examples like, as I said earlier, like if Jakey appears on stage while he's not actually in the play, but we also have an example like this. This stage directions say that Pete, who's a sidekick, runs off the exit with McGinty after him. And the original stage directions don't give an exit to rats. So we've changed that in our editing process, and we made rats follow Pete, because Pete is the sidekick of Larry, and Rats is another sidekick of Pete, so to speak, and Rats never really appears alone or in the play without Pete. And in this case, in Act 1, we've got that Rats is still, according to the stage directions, remaining on the stage, but he has nothing to do there. Later in the play, the stage directions let him appear again on stage, so clearly he was forgotten to get off stage. And it made sense to let him go off here because Pete leaves, and it made sense to let them leave together. Okay, so this should have given you a brief overview of the issues you face when you want to stage this 19th century melodrama. But I would like to move on to another question, namely, what do we learn from One of the Bravest? And we learn also a lot about firefighting and the professionalization of the firefighters to that time. So if you look at this, it's again 41, talking to Larry, or I don't know, talking to someone else, I think. And so do I remember it? Shall I ever forget it? Say, boys, you should have seen us that night. 3 foreign vessels all ablaze, ice on the river, 3 feet thick, and still a thickening. We managed to get the water there for a while, till it froze in the hose as it ran. Our feet were stiff with cold, while our hands and faces were blistered with the heat. Poor Jack Wallace went under that night, so did Walter Ross, old 41 fireman. He left a wife and 3 children. All boo-hoo cry? But we got the fire out all the same. Jumping Moses, what a fire we all had, with old 41 and Big 6 coming up 15th Street. So here, first of all, in the second to last line, Jumping Moses, this is another reference to the famous firefighter I talked about earlier, Mose. And then Big 6 is a reference to this. So it is a reference to a fire engine which was used when One of the Bravest was staged. So melodramas can tell us what the fire brigades used, or it can give us cultural knowledge on the firefighter practices. So for example, the life-saving corps was introduced to the fire department of New York in 1883, and the same year in which is the same year in which One of the Bravest was registered as a play. And from the reviews of One of the Bravest, it could also be gathered that the producers of One of the Bravest worked closely together with the fire companies of the respective cities. For instance, one veteran association contributed to the play by providing a whole parade of firefighters for the performance in the People's Theater in New York. So here again, technological advances are important in staging melodramas. As Professor Hochbruck mentioned earlier, the special effects of melodramas were sophisticated products of the latest advances in applied sciences, and this is also true for the firefighting stage. Okay, so let's take a look at the stage directions of the fire scene in One of the Bravest. Reference to Boucicault's fire scene here. We have, in this image you can definitely see how one of the fire scenes could have been staged. You see the fire, the building burning, the scaling ladders, all the fire engines getting on stage, and I'm not sure what else to say about that, but Professor Hochbruck can definitely tell more about it later. Good, so fire scene in One of the Bravest. These are the stage directions we got for the fire scene. I'm just going to briefly read it out to you. So we have full stage, large set tenement house up sea on fire, door and windows break, rope with ring hanging over roof, everybody shouting, fire bells ringing, fire engine drives on, all characters. So Larry, who is in the house, breaks down door and carries Mrs. Heath down and off, left, second exit left, two small boys with the nightgowns in the third story. They break open the shutters and jump down into a blanket held by the firemen. Then Mrs. Grogan in nightdress jumps. Larry climbs scaling ladder to second story. 41 hands him up another. He bursts it through the third story window, climbs up and goes in, has belt and hoop about his waist, hooks a rope to the ring hanging over the roof, makes a twist on the hook of his belt, seizes Rosie around the waist, swings out of the window and descends with her. All shout. So the description of this scene, I think it speaks for itself. The heroic fireman rescues the damsel from a burning building. He does not fear for his own life. He performs extremely risky actions, climbing scaling ladders to the second floor in order to reach Rosie. And in the reviews, it could be gathered that this effort of this fire scene was highly appreciated by the audiences. For instance, one review said, "The burning tenement house at the People's Theater burned amid wild enthusiasm." And the sensation scene caused such enthusiasm that it drew large audiences to various minor theaters to see One of the Bravest for many years to follow. And another review states that the fire scene, with real horses, steam engines, and life-saving appliances, is one of the finest ever put on stage. So this spectacle, this extreme spectacle fire scene, gives the audience the chance to be part of this illusion of a real-life event, and then to enjoy seeing the heroes at work. This shows, so this slide shows how the stage setting might have been arranged according to this description we had in the TypeScript. I've also brought you one example of a fire scene which was recorded in 1904, just to also give you a further insight into how such a fire scene could have been performed. So they're bringing up the scaling ladders on the right-hand side. You can see people climbing up. They're preparing the blanket on the ground. So now you can see people jumping. Another one. And another one. So it's a lot of smoke. Yeah, so that's pretty impressive. People jumping, fire engines, lots of smoke, scaling ladders. I think this gives you a pretty good idea of how these spectacle sensation scenes worked back then. So pretty sensational scenes, but poor plot. Because simplicity was the highest law of melodramatic writing, authors of melodramatic works reduced the characters, structure, and ideas to the lowest terms of the plays. Thanks to this formula, a melodrama could easily be written down by almost anyone, and in no time at all. So according to Giraud, the average time to manufacture a melodrama was around 1 week, which is not a long time to write a whole play. All these melodramas must also have had some songs and dances, and as Professor Hochbruck said, it's really hard to find those, but for One of the Bravest, we found a songster, which is pretty cool that there is an existing songster. And here again, you can see that it's colorfully made, but on the songster, it says Giles McCarthy again, and not Edmund E. Price, because Giles McCarthy was the lead actor and the producer as well. In the script itself, there was not a lot of music mentioned, so we haven't got the information which music is used. Sometimes we have the whole lyrics, but sometimes there's a stage direction when orchestra comes in, or sometimes it just says she sings a song, something like that. So the songster brought us some new insight into how One of the Bravest could have been performed musically. And I brought you four examples. First of all, we have title song, which is of course called One of the Bravest. You can see it on the left-hand side here. And we also have this fully transcript in our play, so this wasn't a surprise. But then we have the song next to it. It's called Mrs. Grogan's Boy, and this was clearly composed for One of the Bravest because Mrs. Grogan is a character in the play. She's the funny Irish woman who's a bit silly and a bit funny. But this was new to us, and it did not appear in the transcript. And then we have got something which is rather unusual. We've got here a song with actual music to it. There are like more than 20 songs in this songster, but only 2 of them have actually music in it. So this makes it possible to get an idea what it must have been like. And this song is called Maddie J. There's no reference at all to One of the Bravest, so to the play we've got. But I mean, it must have been performed at some point. We don't know in which cases and in which performances, but it's pretty interesting that we have the music here to see. And on the right-hand side, we've got one other song, which is not in the script. It's called the Gallant Fire Brigade, and this clearly is a song that could have been used in any firefighter melodrama, and it's not specific to One of the Bravest. And because it also doesn't refer to any part of the play. And as mentioned earlier, sometimes there are only lyrics in the transcript, and then they would just use an existing popular melody, use basically the pop songs of the time, and then put the new lyrics on top to fit your play. So that's for One of the Bravest. To finish that up, One of the Bravest was a classic melodramatic text, and it gave us an idea of what most people and not just the educated part of the society liked at a certain time. And it lives by using these extremely great and technologically sophisticated fire scenes as a spectacle. So I'm sure it must have been quite a blast to see One of the Bravest on stage back in the days. So that's all I've got to say, and I leave the stage again to Professor Hochbruck.
Thank you, Damaris. So how would somebody like Stephen Crane react to this kind of material? As I said, there was also a realist stage at the time. This is a scene from the most famous of them all by the man on the right. Does everybody recognize him? That chap? Mr. Oscar Wilde. Jesus Christ. And this is from The Importance of Being Earnest, of course. This is Algernon Moncrief and his buddy. And realism here, I can't quite decide whether the backdrop's actually painted or not, but the furniture and also that looks very much like Augustin Daly's The Railroad of Love. So this would have been the typical kind of stage naturalism, even in portraying the reality of the time in at least the stage setting. The psychological realism of the time is more usually connected with people like Henrik Ibsen on the left, and the other one, I won't even ask if you recognize him. No, that's not Sean Connery. In disguise, this is George Bernard Shaw. And if you've never ever heard of this gentleman here, that's perfectly excusable, because James Hearn is sometimes referred to as the American Ibsen, which of course is a damning praise. It's something like the Canadian Tolstoy, which is supposed to be Margaret Lawrence, or as the former mayor of Stuttgart once claimed for one painter living in Stuttgart ist er weltberühmt. So this is the American Ibsen, forget about him. Stephen Crane, however, had some brushes with the theater, let's put it this way, rather than becoming a playwright himself. And this is kind of surprising insofar as the man was constantly strapped for money. And melodrama writing was easy money, in a way. No, not much, but easily gained. However, Crane criticized both the concepts of melodrama of the time. He made fun of some of the production aspects, and he looked critically at audience reactions. And one of the instances where we can see this clearly is in his first novel, in Maggie, where he describes Maggie's reaction to a melodrama that she sees. She gets invited there by her erstwhile boyfriend. And to Maggie and the rest of the audience, this was transcendental realism. That's an important thing to say here. And I'll give you a short passage from Maggie that tells you what this transcendental realism encompassed.
In the hero's erratic march from poverty in the first act to wealth and triumph in the final one, in which he forgives all the enemies that he has left, he was assisted by the gallery, which applauded his generous and noble sentiments and confounded the speeches of his opponents by making irrelevant but very sharp remarks. The last act was a triumph for the hero. Poor and of the masses, the representative of the audience over the villain and the rich man, his pockets stuffed with bonds, his heart packed with tyrannical purposes, imperturbable amid suffering. Maggie always departed with raised spirits from the showing places of the melodrama. She rejoiced at the way in which the poor and virtuous eventually surmounted the wealthy and the wicked. The theatre made her think. She wondered if the culture and refinement she had seen imitated, perhaps grotesquely by the heroine on the stage, could be acquired by a girl who lived in a tenement house and worked in a shirt factory.
So, if the American dream is a fact, then this is realism. Now, this is how it happens, this is how the good are rewarded and the evil are punished. If this is not realism, then it's actually already modernism, which we are not at yet, or rather, Stephen Crane's Maggie provides the transition stage between the realism of the 1870s through 1910s and modernism of around the 1890s. Now, this is an overlap period in American and in British literary history, clearly. So, but Crane noticed these plays. Crane noticed the influence they had on their audiences, on the belief systems that they generated in the audiences. So he made fun of it. Some hints for playmakers appears in the satirical magazine Truth in 1893, where he proposes that Irish melodramas should have titles like Akushla Mavornin, which is senseless because Akushla means darling and Mavornin also means darling. But hero, heroine, villain, and that's all we get. This is the text here. You know? Society play, all men are odious pigs. Contemporary feminists would possibly subscribe to that, except for the nice man. The evil old woman turns out to be his long-lost grandmother. Obviously a plot item that appeared in melodrama every now and then. In action plays, the chief villain is subdued by the hero with his 44 Colt, which I didn't bring today. And then there is social romantic comedy with dance, music, juggling, and song, however incoherent that may have been as a plot and performance. That Crane was not abject to using stereotypes you can also see in another contribution to Truth in the same year, where he writes a short play called At Clancy's Wake. It's actually just 5-6 lines, and everybody gets drunk there. Mike Clancy, a fine man, what's the difference between an Irish funeral and an Irish wedding? There's one less drunk at the funeral. So this is the kind of sense of humor that you get in these kind of scenarios. Here is a complete play by Stephen Crane, just called a prologue. The Roycroft Quarterly was not necessarily a satire magazine. But here, the gloomy stage, curtains at window, large book opened, moonbeam no wider than a sword blade pierces the curtains, falls upon a moment of silence, and then riotous drinking and laughter, swift quarrel, din and crash of a fight, a little... This is all actually just a stage direction, right? So there's only one line in the play, obviously, a mother who says, my son, a moment of silence, curtain, which... Albert Hubbard, the editor of the Roycroft Quarterly, quipped at that this was the shortest temperance play on the record. And possibly it actually is. This is not all that Crane did for the theater. He also wrote a short story in which a man comes to grief, actually dies in a theater fire, because they've really manacled him, in a play that had a farm scene in it wherein real horses had drunk real water out of real buckets, afterward dragging a real wagon off stage. So the audience goes wild because of this perfect naturalism, theatre nouveau, and that's this realism of the stage taking to another step onwards towards naturalism, only that with his real manacles he can't get out of the theatre and dies. It's from his perspective, so one of Crane's typical narratological experiments, giving an impossible narration. You don't usually get narrations from somebody who ends up dead. And you keep waiting throughout the story for something to save him, but it doesn't happen. Crane was better at narrative than he was at drama. That much is a fact that we can establish. Still, there were people who wanted to cooperate with him, and not really small names in the field. There is Joseph Conrad, for instance, who, however, did not really make a splash as a dramatist either, but certainly David Belasco did. In fact, he was the man for the realist and naturalist stage, devoting enormous amounts of time and effort and money to staging effects, not necessarily sensational in the sense of blowing up steamboats and fire scenes like we just had here, but sunrises and sundowns. I talked about that in the introduction. And if you're wondering why William Gillette here is wearing a Sherlock Holmes hat, that's because he introduced the Sherlock Holmes hat. He was Sherlock Holmes in the adaptations of the Sherlock Holmes stories, which William Gillette himself wrote. So this is why, and this is why there's the extra comedy in Buster Keaton's 1926 movie called Sherlock Holmes Jr., in which he has a sidekick figure named Gillette, played by William Gillette. But that's slightly besides the point. So back to Stephen Crane and his one theatrical effort, the one performance ever that Stephen Crane signed responsible for, which was in the tradition of the British Christmas pantomime, which was usually a musical comedy stage production designed for family entertainment. Here it goes beyond the family. Crane invited a lot of people to provide a line or a paragraph for a panto that he was going to write called The Ghost. The traditional pantomime has a lot to, is indebted a lot to the Commedia dell'arte, the Italian 16th century format. There are mask elements, there's music hall, and there's a lot of slapstick comedy. And all of that was supposed to take place in Breed Place in Suffolk, where Crane and his wife lived at the time. The play, as I said, was supposed to be called The Ghost. We know some things about it because of Jesse Chrysler's 1973 article, and some students of mine and I found out more, and I think we found out just about everything there is to find about this play. These are the cooperation partners. Oops, that should be English. Some of the names are fairly well known. Henry James is here, H.G. Wells, Conrad, Henry Rider Haggard, George Gissing. Robert Barr was the one who finished Crane's last novel after he died. They all contributed something to this play about the so-called breed giant. So this is something that has to do the ghost of Sir Goddard Oxenbridge that is supposed to appear in this Christmas panto. Sometimes he's also referred to as the Sussex Ogre, and no, that's not him at the bottom right, that's actually Henry VIII, but Sir Goddard Oxenbridge lived in the same age at the same time as Henry VIII. This is his tomb in St. George Church in Breed. The ogre, because there are a variety of stories about him, one of which is that he was supposed to have been a child-eating cannibal. So not exactly a nice person. The main contributor, besides Crane himself, was Alfred Edward Woodley Mason, who is more well known these days for the films that were made out of his romances, particularly The Four Feathers with the late Heath Ledger. But The Ghost, for all we can reconstruct, was an extravaganza. Now, this is another subgenre to not the melodrama, but dramas and including pantos. A loosely structured musical play. The songs usually not written for this one, but popular tunes of the period with a new text, sometimes a satire of the original, sometimes adapted to the story that's been followed here. And we know that here the songs had to do with this ghost thing, because we've actually found some of the music, like the final chorus here. It says final chorus, Breed Place, December 29th in 1899, which was the day that this play was actually staged, not in Breed Place, not in the country manor that the Cranes inhabited, but in the school in Breed Hill, the schoolroom. Here's even a ticket that somebody preserved. The schoolroom is now part of the rectory of the church in Breed. Here are some of the party guests. That's Barr and H.G. Wells. Unfortunately, on the second day, Crane suffered a tuberculosis-induced hemorrhage. That is, he vomited up blood, and that ended the party rather abruptly. So people dispersed in all directions, and half a year later, he was dead. And his final involvement with the theater can be seen here. In a short notice, I've tried to find the article that's been mentioned here, David Belasco's on the genius of Stephen Crane. Some of the things in this short article don't add up. It's claimed that Belasco got the manuscript of the unfinished novel, The O'Ruddy that can't be the case because Robert Barr, as I said, finished it eventually, and it was never turned into a drama, definitely not by David Belasco. And A.E.W. Mason did not work on the conclusion of the Orodi either, or maybe if he ever did, he apparently gave up on it at some point. So there's never been a complete performance of The Ghost of Breed Place, and possibly there never will be unless somebody makes a huge effort there. And Crane is more a commentator on drama than he ever was an author, but we can learn something about the stage and the theater of his days from his prose and from his letters, rather than from anything play-like that he ever wrote himself. Thank you. We'll have a final curtain. Everybody please back on stage. And for that, usually then also the technicians come on the scene, yeah? Thank you all for attending, and see you all next week.